the use of talking? They won't let the white man live. Course if there's any work to do to a Chinese bloke they'll give. Sack 'em all you straight-head natives. Take my advice and plan, and turn your skin the right side in and become a Chinaman. Oh, goodbye, Mrs. Doolan. Oh, ta-da, Mrs. Doyle. No more I'll roam around Ireland or plate your Emerald Isle. But I am bound for China. It's there I will be found. I'm off to join the Chinamen. To Hong Kong I am bound.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You are listening to the Natives Rouseabout podcast. I'm Grant, and it's the 3rd of December 2022, the commemoration of the Eureka Rebellion. And tonight I'm joined by Adam and Mitch. How you going, boys?
Good, mate. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad. Mitch?
Going very well, thanks. Grant, yes, and glad to hear that you were doing likewise as well.
Oh, very good, very good. So it's been a long-awaited podcast, this one. I promised at the end of the last one that we were going to be talking about the Shearers strike. And sounds simple enough, but large subject matter, and it causes a lot of people to sweat when they've got to do a bit of reading. So we're going to endeavour to do our best to talk not only about the Shearers strike, but also touch a bit about some other union stuff that occurred before the Shearers strike, in more so Victorian history in Australia. So gentlemen, if you were to quickly sum up for a layman, what's your understanding of the union movement in the nationalist cause? Mitch?
Well, Grant, I consider myself someone pretty new to the whole nativist scene. So I'm learning, and my understanding of this is probably constantly changing. But I suppose at this point, two things that strike me about it is one, how fundamental it is to Australian identity. The idea that this labour movement is really at the heart of Australian identity, and that it was a movement about obviously ensuring the rights of workers against the interests and the rather gross exploitation of the mine owners and the squatters, etc. But also very closely tied to that was how much of that was connected to the idea of white Australia and developing that Australian identity along the lines of being a white country. Because what really served to undermine those conditions that the workers were fighting for was the fact that they were fighting scab labour, and that scab labour was Chinese, and that they were not able to compete against that because of the incredibly low wages, that the bowl of rice, as you've alluded to previously, that the Chinese workers were prepared to work for, which really just undermined the entire standard of living that the white workers were working for. And I certainly get the impression that they were prepared to do it for less, but they didn't bring the skill and the craft, certainly as far as the shearing was concerned, and presumably, with that, they didn't bring the pride to the work. There was an enormous amount of pride from the shearers in what they did and their ability, and that too was being pretty significantly undermined, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, good summary, bro. Well, look, to get started on the subject, I might do a little bit of an introduction to I suppose, to set the scene in Australia. Long before the Shearers strike and before the union movement, there were a few pieces of political work at play. So we read in Percy Stevenson's Australia's History in 15 decades, which is his kind of summary from First Fleet landing to somewhere in the 19th century, that basically at the outset of Australian settlement, there were enormous land grants given to kind of financial interests from the United Kingdom that eventually turned into different mines and agricultural properties, sheep stations, cattle stations, stuff like that. One particular egregious land monopoly was given to one fellow from the United Kingdom. I believe his surname was McCoy, and he was given the only land known that had coal in Newcastle, and he had a land lease on that land for, I think it was a 100-year lease given in his name. So he had a monopoly until coal was found somewhere else. He had a monopoly on coal for about 30 or 40 years in the early 19th century. And basically he was able to jack the price right up to whatever he wanted because no one had any discovered coal to compete with him. There's all these stories of just millions of acres of pristine land just being licensed to kind of these well-established families from the United Kingdom, these, the old aristocracy, basically getting their slice of Australia handed to them at next to no cost. And so you have the outset, you have these kind of land barons set up all around Australia. And in 1846, the Masters and Servants Act was passed in the colonial parliament. The Masters and Servants Act basically set in motion something that was, detrimental to, I suppose, the liberty of workers. It was said that in the legislation, when a worker agreed to a contract, say, you come work on my farm for 6 months at this agreed rate of maybe, 20 pounds. If you breach that contract, if you leave, if you basically don't meet your terms of the contract, the person the business or the land baron could pursue you for not only financial damages but actually send you to prison for 3 months. So you had in the colony this setup where you had the land barons who had the resources and the finances to actually employ people, but employees were always under the threat of basically being put in prison and criminalized for not fulfilling their side of the contract. There were a lot of cases where shearers were and miners were put on contracts, and the employer would basically skim money off their wages, would put them into shocking poor conditions like accommodation. The safety was ridiculous. In a lot of mines, you had poor ventilation. There was no requirement to regularly inspect and maintain machinery. So miners were going in not only on tremendously low wages, but they were also going in to unsafe and unsanitary conditions. And any reasonable man would want to probably leave those conditions after encountering them. But then, due to the Master and Servants Act, they were also, down the barrel of risking going to prison for breaching contract and leaving, and all the other penalties that come with that. So the scene is set, it's pretty dire. Not a lot of justice is done to this side of Australian history. There's a lot of conservatards out there who will, throw a stone at unionism every moment chance they get. But
recovering conservatard here, I must confess, Grant. So yeah, apologies for not having seen the light a little bit earlier. But you please go ahead and finish this spiel. But to that point, there is something that I do want to jump in with on that whole idea of seeing the light. But no, please finish your spiel.
No,
here.
That's all right. Well, look, that's pretty much covered setting the scene. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, obviously, unionism now is a bit more of an interesting beast, because you have the statutory protections, apparently, which maybe not upheld in all cases. And so there's a bit of corruption in the unions, no question about it. I mean, what's your take on it generally?
Well, yeah, and aside from that, clearly the modern union movement is very much the lapdog of the globalists, which is the complete antithesis of what the original union movement was in Australia. But as far as the conservatard or the libertarian sort of argument goes, I mean, I was quite struck looking at that Masters and Servants Act. I was doing a little bit of reading on it earlier today, actually, and so it peaked when you brought it up. I mean, the libertarian argument has always been, well, you know, if you don't like the terms of your employment, you can just walk away, and that's what it means to be in a free society. And, you know, we're all about freedom. But so it's quite remarkable to look at something like this piece of legislation, and say, well, actually, you weren't free. Like the contract wasn't about these are the terms of the contract, and if you break them, the contract is terminated. These are the terms of the contract, and if you break them, you can go to prison. You're basically a slave. So that really flies in the face of the whole we're champions of freedom angle that conservatives and libertarians play, and which it looks like the squatters were playing back in the day, because freedom of contract was everything that they were fighting for, supposedly. But yeah. I think the other part of that, and a big thing that sort of certainly a factor in changing my perception of things. In terms of land ownership and monopolisation of the land, I probably didn't think, and if I can defend those who maybe came from my background as well before seeing the light, maybe others didn't really think through the full origins of, well, where does land ownership ultimately come from? And I probably had this perception, well, if you are a large property owner, like the squatters or the miners were back in the day, you've probably come to acquire that land through your hard work, through your resourcefulness, all this kind of stuff. But ultimately, when you look at the history of it, in the early days when land was up for grabs, basically, and initially, in many instances, sort of illegally up for grabs, which is where the term squatting comes from, it was a case of finders keepers. And these pastoralists and miners and the like were basically horribly exploiting these workers from the mere fact that they came across and got onto the land first. And it's as simple as that. And when you understand it from that perspective, I think it changes things pretty dramatically.
Yeah, it does.
If I could add something in quickly to what you were saying there before, Grant, as well. You spoke specifically about the safety in the mines and in workplaces and things like that. And I'd just say it's a stark contrast to what we have in workplaces today, and that might have occurred organically anyway. But if we want to focus particularly on the mines, from what I've heard, if you want to change a light bulb in the mines, you've got to set up SCAF, and everything is hyper safe. And that might be due to kind of the legal side of things and how litigious people are these days. But I think you have to give a little bit of credit to the labour union movements of those days for setting up a system that facilitates that. But I think you were heading in the direction before, Grant, of potentially implying that some of the modern unions maybe aren't as focused on the interests of the Australian people and the Australian workers as much as the labour union movement was back in the day.
Yeah. Look, I've spoken to a lot of people. Like I am a union member myself. I have been for some years. But I've spoken to a lot of people who are not union members, that are kind of lower common tradesmen, and they'll say, all the union want you to do is pay the dues, pay the correct, join the correct superannuation fund, and fucking that's it. That's the last. You don't hear from them again. They don't have an active role in your employment or about improving your life, where traditionally the trade union was actually a core tenet of the community and actually had a role to play in the improvement of people's lives. similar to a fraternal organisation, but it also advocated for them in an industrial sense. But yeah, look, let's not get entirely sidetracked on the on just talking about unionism generally. Let's dig into a little bit of the history. So I'd mentioned mining, and mining conditions were terrible. I've read some old common law cases from the United Kingdom where people had been killed, and families had sued for compensation for basically mine owners not taking reasonable care to prevent people from being killed by not checking that lifts work properly, for example. There was a few court cases where in coal mines these vertical 15-story deep lifts had failed because the mining company couldn't be bothered spending the money on inspection and maintenance on lifts, that the lives of miners were inconsequential versus the cost of maintenance. And those cases were actually thrown out because there was actually no legal right back then to claim compensation for the death of the provider of a family. That eventually came by an act of Parliament because of the general public outrage caused by this kind of fledgling union movement in the United Kingdom. But it's definitely, we do take a lot of things for granted. And in 1872, in Victoria, the first group of miners working in different mines in the area, copper, iron, gold, they formed the first Miners' Association. So William G. Spence, who went on later to found the Australian Workers' Union, he was there to help form the first Miners' Association in 1872. And their key tenets, I suppose, in the formation of their association was to advocate for an 8-hour working day, the removal of Chinese from the mines, and the health and safety of their workers. So they wanted to ensure, first, their biggest priority was ventilation. In that time, there were countless episodes of people basically being killed by asphyxiation. These coal mines deplete oxygen in the air, and if you don't have sufficient ventilation, you will die. And some people were working in caves where you couldn't light more than 2 candles. There'd be enough oxygen to light 1 candle. Or they'd have their ventilation pipe, which is a small diameter tube, and there'd only be enough oxygen coming in through that tube. They could have a candle within 100 millimeters of the end of the tube before it went out. So that the oxygen levels were ridiculously low in some of these caves. And the Miners' Association was a strong advocate for getting proper ventilation in some of these structures. In addition to that, the maintenance of machinery, things like lifts and steam drills and all of the rest of it, which when faulty often result in fatalities of not just one but probably multiple people. Sounds like you're going to say something, Adam.
Oh, my mic was muted, but no, I was just kind of listening to you explain that situation. But yeah, again, like, look, what we're talking about here is like severely exploitative kind of circumstances for the workers, and it kind of shows you what a workplace, or particularly a trade workplace or a mining workplace or something in that kind of industry where you have a distinction between the managerial kind of side of things and the people getting their hands dirty. It kind of gives you an understanding of where that kind of thing heads when there is no protection for the workers. And particularly when the focus is primarily material and profit based, rather than potentially for the betterment of the community and for the betterment of society, which is what these things like the mines should have been something, and should be today as well. This is an issue today, where they're primarily a profit making endeavor, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but there should also be some amount of focus on the use of it benefiting the community and the society. If you want to compare it to something today, it's like we make a lot of money probably out of having Indian coal mining companies mine our resources, but are they resources that could be better used by our nation to better our own situation?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I find atrocious about this is just thinking again, to the Masters and Servants Act. Imagine if you travelled across the state, at the promise of a new job, you sign the contract, and you go down, 10 stories deep into a coal mine for 10 hours per shift, where you can hardly breathe in tremendously unsafe and just kind of unsanitary conditions. And your options are to continue and potentially die or face prison, and also the fact that you've probably bet a lot of money on traveling across the state just to get to your new place of employment. You're probably going to be in prison for 3 months, and then you're going to be impoverished. Tremendously hard conditions. And
yeah, that's the other thing is like you might be put in prison and impoverished afterwards, but even if, let's say, you lose that job and you're not put in prison somehow, how difficult is it going to be for you to find a job that has better conditions? Like, it's probably not even a possibility.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, everyone's playing by the same rules. The conditions can't be much better anywhere else.
Grant, am I right in saying that some of this stuff that was going on, and this might actually relate more to some of the legal rulings that came in around the strikes, but it was based on precedents from the UK that had already been overturned in the UK but were then upheld in Australia? I seem to remember coming across something like that.
Look, I probably couldn't give you a very clear-cut answer on that. I do know that the Master and Servants Act of New South Wales was a statute homegrown and made here. It wasn't imported from the United Kingdom. There was probably a lot of disputes in the colonial territory. So the way the Masters and Servants Act work is actually justices of the peace were the ones that were able to sentence people to prison. There wasn't even courts that were acting upon this. That if an employer had an employee run away, he would go to 2 justices of the peace, and those 2 justices of the peace would be authorised to issue a warrant for that worker's arrest and imprisonment. It's very like frontier justice legislation that probably does depart a bit from the UK at this point in time. But the UK definitely did have this challenge for a long way. I mean, some of the mining cases that I've read from the UK were in the 1870s, where people were still being killed and machines not being maintained and all the rest of it.
That's leads to another question I had as well, I suppose, and that obviously to an extent, what's going on in Australia is mirroring what's happening in other places in the world in this point in time, in the UK especially. Given Australia's reputation for really being a leading force in the development of that early union movement, this sort of stuff that people like William Spencer are engaging in at this point in time, in going on to form the Australian Workers Union, how does that compare with what's going on around the world at the similar time? Is that is that a really pioneering thing, or is it mirroring what's going on elsewhere?
Oh, look, I think it was happening in parallel with the United Kingdom. So the Amalgamators Miners Association, which went to form over Victoria, I think they based their constitution on a UK miners' union. So it definitely wasn't entirely an Osnian invention, but there was a bit of cross pollination between Australian and British unions. I think that the very pioneering and the very unique thing here was obviously the ethnic component to it. Obviously, nowhere else in the world, apart from Australia and the United States, was there an influx of Chinese and other foreign, I suppose, non-European workers. So the union movement here in Australia needed to not only compete with financial interests, but also with the looming constant threat of, an unquenchable horde of foreign, slave labourers. So that initial Miners Association, 1872, they went on to form that Amalgamators Miners Association, 1874, and they managed to succeed in securing 8-hour workdays for the miners and massive improvements to ventilation of mines and the inspection and maintenance of machinery. So there was pretty quick and fast wins with the Miners Association in Victoria, starting branches all throughout the Bendigo and all the other mining towns in the area. So yeah, pretty successful. And in 1876, I suppose the ethnic element of it reached a fever pitch at Creswick in Victoria, where the Lothair gold mine, basically the directors of that mine set about to import a whole bunch of Chinese labourers to work there for about a quarter of the wages. The manager of that mine kind of got heard that the board was proposing this, and he was an Australian. He was not keen on the idea, and anonymously took out an ad in the newspaper and said that that they were going to introduce Chinese, and that all the miners should meet at this hotel at this time. Anonymously, the manager of the mine dobbed in his bloody board, and the cool. Miners, a true patriot.
Absolutely.
All the miners met at this hotel, and they sent out scouts in every direction. So there was like three roads heading into the town, and they ended up barricading all three roads, like turning over wagons on them, and probably about 100 people to each post, women and children included. Like the whole town went out by torchlight. Apparently there was a band as well playing drums and fife. Big event to this planned introduction of Chinese miners was literally intercepted on the road. The board of the mine actually paid for a police escort for the Chinese horse wagons. And what ensued, as detailed in Spencer's book, Australia's Awakening, was a violent struggle between the police and these big groups of union workers that were trying to prevent scabs from getting into their town. The Chinese were actually effectively repelled. The police were massively outnumbered, and that was a huge win in 1876, and that went on, and the mine backed down at that point. They realised that we're just going to have to accept, honest profits at the back of Australian workers. So William Spence was there for that, and the Amalgamated Miners Association became a solidified force in Victorian mining, and they were there to represent their workers, and they built a sizable membership. The other thing they also did was set up an injury fund for workers. So the mines would actually pay into this injury benefit fund. So where miners got injured, they'd be able to have their bills settled for a reasonable amount of time, which was a pretty big innovation, where it wasn't actually coming directly out of union members paying their dues. It was actually the mines themselves submitting to paying into an injury fund for the workers.
Interesting. I just wanted to quickly pop my head in and say something. I've just identified in that kind of story that you've told there, like this 3 categories or 3 groups that seem to interact in like this perennial issue, which is like the main group we're discussing, obviously, and our focus is the Australian working class or the Australian people. In this situation, interacting with a foreign labour force who's willing to work for cheap, and they drive the price of labour down, whether that's due to being willing to work for cheap prices or even just due to an oversupply of labour. And then this third group, which is like some level of establishment that's willing to quell efforts for workers' rights for the Australian people. And that's something that's seen then and seen throughout, I guess, a few of the things that we'll speak about on the podcast. and it's still seen today. Frankly, we saw the same thing with the union recently, who was willing to, well, yeah, the union recently was willing to shut down work for workers, and we had a big riot in Victoria about it.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know how
Yeah,
far we want to go into that.
when Setka the dog, just completely rolled over to these bloody vaccination mandates in Victoria. Yeah, that was incredible. But it just goes to show, like, you know, that the current, you know, union leadership just have no integrity. You know, you just don't know what went on behind the scenes.
I have a theory.
Oh yeah,
I don't know if I can. I don't know if I can. Well, I don't know if I can put it out there. Am I going to get myself into legal trouble?
Oh, possibly. In a romantic novel, someone received a brown paper bag filled with cash or something to the equivalent. I don't know. Who knows?
Oh well, in a romantic novel, someone was up on domestic violence charges, and then those domestic violence charges, after a certain incident, quietly went away. So.
Sounds like an interesting romantic novel. I might have to give this one a read.
It's as far as romantic novels go, it's pretty different. But so I don't know. I don't know if that maybe plays into it. But I mean, you're totally right in it that it shows how far the union has fallen, and just the inability of both the major parties at the moment to represent their base. Now that was an issue. It was about workers' rights and about personal freedom. They should have been core issues for both Labor and Liberal, and neither one actually took a stand on it. It's a pretty sad state of affairs. But anyway.
Yeah. I guess there is some level of difference there in that, like, that wasn't a foreign labour issue as such, but it was selecting for who can work and who can't by who's maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but selecting for who can work by who has or who hasn't taken a vaccine. So it is pitting, in a way, if the workers are either together or separate, it's pitting some workers against scab labour, which seems to be the issue over time.
Yeah. I mean, look, to the CFMEU's credit, they did actually fight the vax mandate in Queensland and actually succeeded in getting BHP to come to heel. And I don't know, like, there was definitely a court decision that prevented that mining company from enforcing their mandate. I don't know if they eventually, because they didn't follow the consultation requirements properly in order to do it.
Because the difference, Grant, the difference there, though, was that was something that BHP had done of their own accord. It wasn't actually government enforced. Is that right?
True. Yeah, that's right.
Which is crazy. The government can enforce it, and then a company has no choice but to go along with it, and will face legal consequences if it doesn't. But then, when the government doesn't, the company may actually face legal consequences for trying to enforce it itself. It was just, it was a ridiculous time. It really was.
Yeah. Anyway, we'll move on.
Yeah.
That's all right. No, that's all right. Well, talking about Melbourne in particular, 1878 was a pretty hot year for Melbourne, where anti-Chinese sentiment, reached its zenith in disputes over furniture manufacturing. So after the gold rush came to an end and the Chinese basically started packing up and leaving the gold fields, they didn't actually go back to China. A lot of them went to Melbourne, where they quickly built themselves, a very strong market share for furniture manufacturing. They would work enormous days at very low wages in very poor conditions. These would be Chinese-owned factories as well, which is a bit of a difference from the gold fields. The gold fields and the land barons that would employ Chinese, they weren't Chinese. But in Melbourne, there were Chinese-owned factories of making furniture. And this caused a lot of drama for Australian furniture manufacturers. And for a number of years there, before 1890, there were a lot of flare-ups of mob violence and vandalism of these kind of Chinese factories by Australian workers who were basically unable to compete with this cheaply made, mass-produced furniture at the fraction of a price of what it would cost an Australian working an 8-hour day to produce at fair wages. So in Melbourne, this struggle really picked up, and in 1890 they passed the Factories and Shops Act in the Victorian Parliament, which actually gave specific limits to how many hours a Chinese factory could work during the day and what days of the week they could work. So, Monday through to Sunday, there was actually a ruling on how many hours a day that factory could work. And it set in place some minimum standards to basically try and improve the parity between Chinese and Australian manufacturers. The most interesting thing to come out of this is the stamping rules for furniture. So there was a rule that any furniture manufactured by Chinese would have to be stamped accordingly. That this was made by Chinese labour. And European furniture, people made by Australians or people of European descent, that this was made by European labour. So you can still find articles of furniture floating around Victoria, and some of it's made its way to New South Wales, which actually has these old stamps. Very interesting period. I mean, 1878, you've got this conflict in Creswick over the gold mine and the introduction of Chinese labour there, and then you've got the dispute over all the furniture factories in Melbourne. I mean, the Chinese were thoroughly creeping into a lot of industry sectors and just causing pure outrage. I mean, it was outrage on an industrial level, for sure, because people were concerned about their wages and they were concerned about basically being replaced by Chinese labourers. But I think as well, people were really starting to form an Australian sense of an ethnic solidarity, that these people were in fact aliens and that there was no greater purpose to the community of them being there and kind of entrenching themselves in building serious industries.
Well, on that, Grant, I wonder, is there much information available, on the impact of that stamping process and how it affected sales of Chinese-produced goods as opposed to goods produced by Australian workers?
Yeah, look, there was a study done looking at the bankruptcy of a lot of these Chinese factories. So there was a lot of competing factors. So in the 1890s, there was actually an economic downturn in Victoria. They called it the land boom crash in Victoria, where a lot of land was speculated on, overvalued, and kind of like a housing bubble crash, and a lot of economic downturn in the 1890s in Victoria, which is considered one proponent of causing these factories to shut. But I definitely believe as well, I don't think there's no analytical way to prove it, I suppose, but I think there was pretty solid grounds to suggest that the stamping system actually prevented a lot of Chinese furniture from being sold, because a lot of Australians just wouldn't buy it. I mean, this is the day and age where the union movement and this sense of ethnic solidarity was at its zenith. William Spencer recounts in his book Australia's Awakening that there was a small town in which there was an industrial dispute. I think it was a mine or a shearing shed. And one fellow decided to scab on his fellow union workers and go into the mine and do a day's work, or a few of them did. And those men were beyond forgiveness for the rest of time in that town. They wouldn't be served in the local pub. The local matrons wouldn't cook them a meal. I think socially, seeing a stamp that this was made by European labour would have made a serious difference back then, far more than what the Australian-made logo means now in terms of consumer decisions.
Yeah, it's. Oh, sorry, Adam, were you going to jump in there?
No, that's right. I do have a point, but you go ahead.
Yeah, oh well, you're absolutely right about the Australian-made logo now not having anywhere near the same impact as what something like that might have back then. But yeah, I haven't read. I've only read snippets of Australia's Awakening, but the kind of thing that you're talking about there, it seems like it really taps into that idea of one part of what Spence is talking about, which I have read, where he talks about the union movement having come to the Bushmen as a religion, and it has, in that kind of excommunicating, it has that religious quality, and it sort of, it seems to me like it almost in this land that was meant to be free of, and I know it didn't actually work out this way in practice everywhere, but in this land that was meant to be free of these kind of sectarian tensions of the old country, that kind of stepped in and filled the void of the old religions in many respects, and became the thing around which the people gravitated around and towards. And yeah, it's a hard thing to get your head around these days, I think, as much as there is obviously still that level of union commitment. I think it's not quite the same.
Yeah. I just the point I had before is just kind of like looking at this situation with the Stamp Act. I think we kind of have to look at, in a way, how it's looked at, how it's kind of perceived retroactively or in hindsight. Obviously, there was some legislation here, the Stamp Act, which had an influence on how the industry was perceived by consumers. But I think the understanding of this situation, if you were to go and look up kind of historical reviews of it that are somewhat modern, is that these Chinese furniture factories were like vilified and legislated against, and that's the sole reason that they went out of business and had to claim bankruptcy. Matt, you brought up the study into this bankruptcy kind of thing, and I think the main thing that was cited was market downturns, limited capital, and high wages, which was also cited by European furniture factory operators. And I think like very much likely due to the Stamp Act, Chinese factories were probably boycotted by white Australians, as they would have probably been, naturally opposed to foreign labour, as seemed to be the trend at the time. But I think to blame it on an institutional push for vilification of the Chinese factories and for a legislation campaign is like a kind of an absurd argument to like pin everything on that.
Yeah, the study did a good job of looking into all the insolvencies and the actual economic underlying causes, which was interesting. You'd think from someone studying that, they'd be like trying to pin it on, racism or whatever.
Yeah.
But it was definitely that land boom collapse, and the higher wages, the Factory and Shops Act, limiting the slave labor hours really made some of these Chinese operations unprofitable.
Yeah. Yeah. There does seem to be this kind of like campaign in our modern view of history to like attribute anything that can be attributed to racism as attributed to racism. Like I would, this is kind of a far-fetched connection, but you might look at something like lynchings in the US, where it's like lynchings occurred exclusively due to racism, when in reality it's a punishment for a crime. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's right.
Like,
yeah.
We maybe don't need to go into the ins and outs of that, but that was just the comparison that popped in my head.
Yeah,
right
true.
then.
Yeah, I mean, look, revisionist historians try and make a bloody hollabunga case out of anything that happened historically. But yeah, anyway, 1878, a hell of a year. And Sydney gets interesting as well. In Sydney, there was the Australasian Steam Navigation Company that wanted to sack all of their, sailors and replace them with Chinese ones who would literally work for a quarter of the wages. So this resulted in a protest, I suppose, probably less so of a strike, because they knew that the Chinese labourers were at hand, and they protested outside of the headquarters of this steam navigation company, and the police actually just charged right in and started malleting these guys on the head. It was quite an interesting debacle. I don't think they were actually successful in repelling the Chinese labour. If I'm not mistaken, they actually did lose, and Chinese navigators were brought in. And it's interesting, that actually happened not too long ago. The bloody union now, they recently amalgamated with the CFMME. It's now the CFMMEU, because the Maritime Union of Australia completely folded. I think it was probably 2 years ago now, there was a ship that was sent up to Indonesia, and as they pulled into port, they all got an email saying, you're now terminated, and you're going to have to change hands with this kind of, I think they might have been Chinese or Indonesian sailors. So they pulled into port, got sacked, off the boat. Here's your replacement. So this stuff still goes on. It's just amazing. And, you know, I think in that case in 1878, they lost the strike. Well, they lost the dispute, and Chinese sailors were brought in, and that built the Maritime Union. After that, it was, everyone realised that this is life or death, and if we don't, you know, all band together, then we're going to be in big trouble. And that's what birthed that union. And so all these unions were really, you know, the 1870s is when all this stuff really starts kicking off, between the mines, the gold mines, the coal mines, the shearing sheds, and the steam navigation and shipping. There was this push by all these financial sectors to bring in this kind of cheap scab Chinese labour to displace Australian or European descent workers. And it just it harrows back to, you know, the kind of things that are happening today. I remember a few years ago, 7-Eleven were being prosecuted for paying Indian workers something akin to 40 cents an hour. It's just unfathomable. It's like, what are you even doing there? Are you just there so you can charge your phone for free or something? Like, I just don't. Yeah. I can't even understand why someone would work for 40 cents an hour.
It's cheaper than what one of their coffees costs.
Yeah, legit. I mean, it might have been that, you know, your own, like, I've heard this stuff happening as well in the security industry. Like, I'll give you an example. I will pay you the proper award wage for 8 hours, but you're going to work for me for 12 or 14 hours. But those, every hour past the 8, you're actually not getting paid for. So what you ultimately works out that you're working for a fair bit underneath, you know, like half the actual award wage. And maybe that was what was going on with the 7-Eleven case.
Yeah. Well, sorry.
No, that's right. I was just going. I only had a quick little comment, which was that at this time these Chinese sailors were working for, I think it was literally half the amount that the Australians were, or it might even have been less than half the amount. So yeah, I mean, it's obviously the same thing is happening today with Indians in 7-Eleven. Like, good luck finding an Australian to work for 14 cents an hour. Fuck that.
Actually, little correction here on the maritime strike. So after those workers did get sacked, but the rest of the Australian sailors, they didn't have enough to replace all of them, went on strike. And that company capitulated 2nd of January 1879, and they discharged all the Chinese crews and re-employed all the Australian seamen who'd been terminated. So actually it was a success, which is nice. I should have written that down before I started talking about it, but anyway.
Big W for the white race there.
Yeah, legit. An actual W for the white race.
Yeah, I imagine that strike did put the kind of ethnic interests of the local Australian workers on the map there as something that was important. Like that's a massive L for kind of international capital.
Yeah, well, that's it. I mean, I heard in a summary on that strike that said that the strike clearly put race, international capital, and labour squarely on the colonial political agenda. That's a way to summarise it. I mean,
That's
all
a good
this
way,
is
yeah.
going on in 1878. Something was in the water that year, you know. It was going off. I mean, it's probably going off elsewhere as well. I mean, I haven't done any preparatory research to talk about the Kanakas in Queensland and the sugarcane industry. But that is a whole other sport for another day to look at. But anyway, to begin to creep towards the focal point of this podcast, which was promised, which is the Shearers strike. So we had established already that there was a Shearers union that was kicked off. Oh, no, I don't think I actually touched on that. So after the dispute in Creswick in Victoria over the Chinese being brought to the gold mines, William Spence was around and he knew a lot of the young men of the town. And one young man actually went off to go away for a season to work outdoors and do some shearing. And he headed out of town and did shearing for 6 or 7 months, came back to Creswick in 1886. And he said to his mother, you know, the conditions were awful and there's no union. You know, there's no union like there is for our miners in our town of Creswick. So, the mother suggested he goes and talks to William Spence from the mining union. And Spence did a bit of organising and coordinated and helped with a couple of people. Apparently there had been attempts to form a shearers union in times past, but it struggled to get off the ground because shearers are a very transient people. They're swagmen. They're travelling on foot. They have no permanent place of residence. They're hard to keep track of and all the rest of it. But, Spence and a few other men did the impossible and actually founded a shearers union in 1886. And they began to advocate on behalf of shearers. And, that Masters and Servants Act was still in play. And what they would actually do is they would provide legal support to workers who'd left a shearing station because of poor conditions or if their wages were being cheated out of them or whatever. And in cases where they lost the legal dispute, the shearers union would actually pay the cost of discharge or the severance cost. So basically the way that the act worked was every servant was worth £20, and if you breached contract, you would owe £20 to the station owner if you were in the wrong. So the union would help cover that £20 cost to try and keep people out of prison if they weren't able to front the money for breach of contract. So this carried on from 1886 quite successfully. The shearers union started taking a good foothold across all the colonies of Victoria, New South Wales, and Queensland, and wool was up. The price of wool was bonanza all throughout Europe, and it was known as the gold of Australia, the next gold. After the gold rush kind of came to an end, wool was the next gold. It was the white gold of Australia. In 1891, the economic conditions started to take a hit. I mentioned that land boom kind of coming to a close, but Europe as well began to really come to a slump, and the price of wool accordingly collapsed. And that's what really kicked off the great shearers strike. Great drama around that. Excuse me. The land barons who owned all the sheep, traditionally they had all been out there kind of on their own, entrepreneurial kind of, exploiting workers on their own accord. But in 1891, with the price of wool falling, they formed a pastoralist union. That was kind of like an industry association for all the sheep running properties. and they basically had the objective to break the unions, and they used all sorts of dirty tactics to do that. They had a lot of corrupt police on the payroll. They illegally intercepted mail and telegrams, and prosecuted union officials and union agitators, got them put in prison. There was a great and famous trial, the famous sedition trial, where a number of union organisers who helped organise the Shearers strike got sent into prison for 3 years for sedition. But William Spence puts in his book Australia's Awakening the following. Pastoral employees had made new or no unreasonable demands. So shearers hadn't made any unreasonable demands, but the squatters had cut wages, and this was bad enough. But when they were going to fill white men's places with Chinese and further insisted on so-called freedom of contract, shearers and shed hands but had no alternative but to go on strike. The fight was bitter. It couldn't be otherwise. The marvel was that it didn't result in a civil war. The efforts of the leaders to try and effect settlement on reasonable lines and the fixed idea of men that they were engaged in a strike alone saved the country from a civil war. William Spence was convinced that the shearers not only had the numbers, but they also had the tactical capabilities, being competent bushmen, to have probably successfully pursued some kind of a revolutionary activity. And on account of that, there was panic on behalf of the government. The colonial government of Queensland dispatched hundreds of soldiers to the west, bringing with them Gatling guns and the whole like, getting ready for a civil war that never eventuated. The colonial secretary, Tozer, issued the soldiers a manual of instructions, and under the heading firing to be effective, they were told not to pick out the leaders and not to fire over their heads, but to shoot straight. So the colonial government, kind of in the back pocket of these wool barons, was dispatching the military to break the union and literally shoot the leaders. Now, this didn't materialize into an open battle, but it very, very nearly came to that. There was all sorts of rumours travelling around the countryside that the army's marching in, or the shearers are about to attack. I mean, there was documented evidence that a train carriage full of rifles was transported all the way to Sydney to one of the shearing camps, that they basically had enough rifles to have overrun the military dispatch. So I think there was 200 soldiers dispatched, but there was probably 800 to 900 shearers on strike, most of them who found themselves with rifles at one point. But yeah, fascinating point in history. The strike itself, on its own merit, didn't materialize into a success. The strike went on for some months, and all these men were living out of camps with their wives and children, basically on the brink of starvation, rather than submitting to lower wages and conditions. But unfortunately, the pastoralists managed to hold out, and the union, they had no choice but to fold it up. They actually ran out of their reserve money and couldn't feed themselves, and had to submit to working alongside Chinese scabs and working for lower conditions and all the rest of it. But, out of that failure, I suppose, there was also a great success in that the Shearers Union, the injustice done to the shearers became a national story, and that everyone had an understanding of what happened there, and became a part of the national folklore. And it was at that time that the union movement realized that they probably weren't going to be able to succeed in their aim of improving, the standard of living of their workers and their members by union activity alone, but politics and electoral politics should be on the table. So Spence, who was a participant in the Great Shearers Strike 1891 in Queensland, he and a few others proposed the formation of the Australian Labor Party, which would actually contest elections to change the policy and bring about change. From their point of view at this time, the government was corrupt. As I said, there was evidence that police had been corrupt, but there was also concern about some of the courts and some of the justices of the courts, which were, strongly anti-Labor and were throwing around statements that police would have been well within their rights to just shoot these unionists that were on strike without any, reasonable case to do so. A number of justices of the peace actually got deregistered or defrocked for being sympathetic to these union advocates. There was a whole range of forms of corruption coming through the government at the time.
Yeah, on that, Grant, that sedition trial that you were talking about before, was that the Rockhampton one?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Yeah, well, you've just, again, something's just tweaked with me there, you talking about that, because I was actually doing a bit of reading on that today, and I think it may have even been that same judge who was quoted as saying police would have been within their rights to shoot, but I think it was something like that. They basically locked the jury up for 3 days until they came back with the verdict that they wanted, or something like that. The jury, and maybe you know a bit more and can give a bit more detail on that. But yeah, the jury was basically held as prisoners until they returned the jury that returned the verdict that the judge was after, as far as I remember. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, well, Spence records in his book that the committee, they were tried in private as well. Like, it wasn't even an open court. No one was allowed to go in there and witness the trial, the sedition trial. What's interesting as well, after they were convicted, after some public outroar, the government actually offered them clemency if they would kind of admit fault and basically, spiritually scab on the union cause. And out of all the men that got imprisoned for 3 years, only 2 of them did that. But the rest of them refused to make an apology for what they did. They declined to crawl and to cringe to such a ruffianly crew as the continuous government, as Spence says. So it was a closed court, it was an absolute stitch-up. I mean, in that song famously sung by the Bushwhackers, the Ballad of 1891, they say that the court had its orders and, the final say is ours. You can have your fill of speeches, but, the judge was obviously in the hand of the pastoralist union, which is just an incredible in broad daylight. Excuse me. In broad daylight, all these men, these kind of innocent men that were advocating for the rights and the welfare of shearers, were just put in jail for sedition, of all things.
Yeah, we tend to think of certain aspects of our legal system maybe being somewhat corrupt today, but I think that probably pales in comparison to. I mean, it's just so open, isn't it? It's quite outrageous to read about it now, I think.
Yeah, well, that's it.
Yeah, definitely. Should we look at kind of the demands of the strike and where that ultimately led to?
Yeah, so I suppose the key tenets of the strike. So there was the first argument, probably the most important argument, was freedom of contract. That basically, before the Great Shearers strike, so when the Shearers Union got going in 1886, they eventually started making closed shops out of shearing sheds. So you had to be a union member to actually work, and that meant that you would be on union wages. You would pay into the union injury benefit fund and all the rest of it. Scabbing wasn't allowed. The pastoralist union wanted to bring an end to that by freedom of contract, so they could individually negotiate with every worker what their wages would be, what their conditions would be, and blah, 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 to start a kind of a race to the bottom of who's most desperate for work. So the big and by extension, that meant the admission of Chinese scab labourers. So, I think the key tenant, William Spence and the AWU or the Shearers Union was going for was a protection of the closed shop model of the sheds, that union members would be used, union members would be paid a fair wage, they wouldn't have a reduction in their wages just due to the fall of the price of wool. They weren't working for heaps of money anyway, like they were already on very, I suppose, meagre incomes as shearers. They expected that the land barons would absorb the cost of the fall of the price of wool. And, as I said, this principle that they were always kind of, the consistent theme in all of these events which we've talking about tonight is that all these workers were always, just teetering on the edge of being replaced by non-unionized Chinese slave labor. And the great shearers strike, when they realized that they needed a political, election-based solution to the problem in the formation of the Labor Party, the Labor Party's first plank was a white Australia, and the second plank was progressive land tax. So it's interesting. The political heritage of the Labor Party here was, they wanted the whole country to be a closed shop for unionized white men working on fair and safe conditions. And second to that, they wanted to twist the elbow of these land barons that were the descendants of royal land grants given millions of acres for basically free. They said, if you're not using this land for productive purposes, if it's sitting there empty while we're all paying top premium dollar for small parcels of land in overcrowded towns and cities, then you should be taxed for that land, and that taxation would go on to improve the social welfare of the nation. So the progressive land tax was, if you don't use it, you're going to have a financial incentive to sell it, so the price of land for housing and smallhold farmers and all the rest of it could be within reach and improve the social welfare of the whole country, basically.
Yeah.
It's interesting, you just reflect on, what the union was struggling with. They were struggling with Chinese scabs, and they were struggling with these unbreakable land barons who'd been given these huge swaths of land. And the AWU and the foundation of the Labor Party was geared at bringing an end to that and doing a service and a justice to the average Australian person.
Yeah.
The progressive land tax is an interesting one, Grant, because it's probably a bit more removed from what we would typically associate with the labour movement and what it fights for. Would I be right in saying that that's drawing somewhat on the principles of Henry George and is a bit of an imported idea from the UK in that sense?
Oh, couldn't tell you. I'm not. I've heard of the name Henry George, but I'm not red pilled on the man. But yeah,
fair enough. I wouldn't say I am either, but just there's something about that when you were saying that. I thought I reckon I've come across this idea elsewhere, and I think it was Henry George and this movement of Georgianism that sprung up around his ideas. It does seem to bear some sort of resemblance to that, based on what I remember of it.
There's definitely cross-pollination because, workers in Australia and workers in the UK were basically fighting the same enemy, which is like this deep, born-to-rule, entrenched financial elite who just get given, crown land grants of millions of acres. I mean, it was in the UK, people had been, maintaining land holdings for generations and generations and generations, and people were fighting against that. And it became a similar story here, but on bloody steroids, because there was so much land to give and there wasn't many men to give it to. So instead of having thousands and thousands of aristocrats struggling over the small land of the United Kingdom, you had like 100 aristocrats fighting over the land of just the endless millions of acres of Australia, which the Crown just unanimously claimed and just divvied up and gave away. So the progressive land tax was, there's all these empty acres sitting there unutilized when there are, young pioneering people who, have grit and have effort, and they'd love to farm that land, but they can't buy it because it's not in the Barons' interest to sell, because if they all sell, then the value of land goes down. But if all of them hold their land, then the value of land is higher. They have more security to loan against and all the rest of it. It's quite similar today. I'll have to post a picture somehow in relation to the podcast. If there's an old copy of the Australian Worker newspaper with the front page has got this giant octopus with land monopoly written on it. It's got its tentacles going all over the empty countryside. And to the bottom left of the frame of the picture is like this small cordoned off area. It says where workers can live. And they're like all in these like closely spaced huts, like living in squalor. It's like, it's always been the greatest hypocrisy of Australian settlement. We've got all these millions and millions of acres, but yet somehow everyone's piled into these bloody cities and small towns. And that's what, these shearers who had navigated the country on foot and on horseback with a swag realised there's all this vacant land completely unused and unutilized, and these land barons are just, printing off it.
It's a very unusual kind of setup, that's for sure. What I kind of, not to divert back to a different kind of aspect of it, but what I found particularly interesting was the way that the demand for the exclusion of low-cost Chinese scab labour led into the White Australia policy, or the Immigration Restriction Act, as a kind of one of the primary acts of the original Labor Party kind of policy. The thing that interested me is that we kind of seem to see a divide here in groups associated with the strike, because the kind of anti-Chinese demands were opposed by the Australian Socialist League, and it seems that this is kind of a turning point where we see the workers' rights from an internationalist and a nationalist perspective, and obviously the Labor Party came in from a nationalist perspective, kind of instituting this Immigration Restriction Act, which like protected us for a significant period of time.
Yeah, that's interesting, Adam. That sort of feeds into what we were saying before, and that there is, isn't there? There is that split in the whole workers' rights movement in terms of building it around a people, a national identity, or focusing on it in a more sort of international kind of sense, which it might be argued in certain aspects has a lot more to do with other things than workers' rights, and workers' rights is maybe a front for pushing through other perhaps more socially destructive ideas. But yeah, that distinction possibly isn't made well enough, and maybe that's why you have groups that enter the picture later. Grant, I'm sure you're in a better position to talk about this. Groups like the old guard and later the new guard that just come to brand everything that fights for workers' rights as communism, because that distinction isn't well enough understood and appreciated.
For me, it's just like a bizarre position. I mean, like the position that you can have like within a country, like an internationalist perspective on workers' rights. Like, how can you uphold these demands that the strike was looking for, such as fair rates of pay, protection of workers' rights and privileges, things like that, when you're decreasing the value of labour by increasing supply? It doesn't even make sense. It has to be a national perspective. It has to be a perspective that's focused on the people that make up the country right now.
Yeah, well, the workability of it also depends on a sense of solidarity, and you can't have a sense of solidarity with people that you have nothing in common with. So that's the thing that strikes me as being just completely illogical about it.
Yeah. 100%.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is an age-old argument. This is Trotsky and Stalin. You know, is it socialism in one country, or is it perpetual worldwide bloody deracinated revolution? And it's interesting how, you know, not only in Australia but in just about every country that's had this kind of argument between democracy, communism, capitalism, socialism, all the rest of it, everyone's had a different spin on it. I mean, Russia, obviously, under old Leon Bronstein Trotsky, he, you know, in the early days of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, they were all for, like, yeah, we're going to do perpetual revolution. Like, we're going to spend all our national resources in getting guns into Germany so that German communists can do a revolution, and so on and so forth into Asia. But what it ultimately panned out being is you know, Stalin, Mao, you know, our bloody old mate from North Korea, can't remember his name. They all basically recognise that
Kim Jong.
King Il-sung or whatever, the original.
The
OG Korean porcupine.
the granddad.
They all recognise that their kind of socialist system relied on like a form of nationalism. That this kind of like cosmopolitan, gay, like class only international system just has no functional value to any real people. It only appeals to kind of like autistic intellectuals and people who usually aren't workers themselves. So it kind of just lost its it lost its bite. So it's the socialism that materialized anywhere in the world, Australia included, was a form of a nationalist socialism, which looked at ethnic solidarity as well as class solidarity, and doing to the benefit of the people. I mean, we talk about the argument in our context in Australia. There's a great piece of work that was written. Alex Saunders is the pseudonym for the fellow who wrote it. Alexander Norwick is his name. He actually passed away a few years ago. He was a real advocate for what's called producerism, which is what old Andrew Fisher was an advocate of back when he was a Prime Minister. That basically there's a serious distinction between, I suppose, communism and producerism, in that producerist ideology is that people who work should be advocated for, and people who are just speculators by owning stocks and shares are not necessarily the aimed benefactor of the policies of government. And Norwick did some other work related to his producerism, arguing against cosmopolitan kind of Marxism and a nationalist form of socialism. But yeah, those are some recommended readings to all of our listeners out there.
I've made a note of producerism, so I'll be investigating afterwards. Thank you, Grant.
No worries. That's a hot and red-pilled word. It's a market-orientated form of socialism. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah. Look. Does anyone else have anything else to add before we close her up tonight?
No. I think you've summed it up pretty well there.
Yeah, just one thing I'll say, Grant, because in reading up on the Shearers strike, I sort of one of the things that was sort of helpful in bringing me up to speed was an article by Clement Semler, which was to do with the impact it had on culture and specifically the literature of the time, which was pretty profound. You know, it comes through in the work of Henry Lawson. Waltzing Matilda is probably the quintessential example of literary work influenced by it. Where the Dead Men Lie by Barcroft bloke, and I think it's not simply the fact that it had that impact, but the fact that it had this profound impact, and it's now being completely forgotten today. I mean, outside of the nativist, the nationalist movement, who talks or cares about the Shearers strike today as an isolated event? And obviously, it's not an isolated event because there was a lot of things that led up to it, but I think there's still probably a little bit of a sense of the general importance of the labour movement to Australia's history, but I think there's not a specific understanding of what the key events were, like the Shearers strike. And I do wonder if that's because to go into it, if you even start going beneath the surface, you can't help but get to that racial element and get to that understanding that Australia was explicitly founded as a white country, and that's probably something that the powers that be don't want the new generation coming through to understand.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, I don't see anyone in the Labor movement advocating for going and reading, the founder of the Labor Party and the Australian Workers Union, William Spence, his book Australia's Awakening. Like, no one's advocating, hey bro, go read that book because you're a Labor guy, you read that book, right? It's no, because it's obvious. It's the nationalist sentiment of the Labor movement was overwhelming. You just can't dodge it.
That's the thing, is I don't think there is actually a wide, amongst the general Australian kind of populace, I don't think there is actually a widespread understanding of how our labour union movements worked, and how they contributed to kind of not exactly the country we have today, but the country that we managed to build by the time we were the working man's paradise. And I think that's something that should be focused on as something that people should learn about, and hopefully this podcast to some extent achieves that, and we can continue working on spreading that a little bit.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, that's something that I've been passionate about for years. Is just this history is just so, it's glorious, I mean, this predates anything exciting going on in 1930s Europe. This is real stuff, and it's real to our heritage. It's very important for people to have an understanding for and to venerate this glorious history. I mean, what you just touched on, Mitch, there about Australian literature, I might just quickly read Banjo Patterson's A Job for
Please
Beginners.
do.
So, Banjo says, "Oh, it's dreadful to think in a country like this, with its chances for work and enjoyment, that a man like McGuinness was certain to miss whenever he tried for employment. He wrote to employers from Bondi to Burke, from Woolloomooloo to Glen Innes, but he found, though his wife could get plenty of work, there was never a job for McGuinness. But perhaps later on, when the Chow and the Jap begin to drift down from the tropics, when a big yellow stain spreading over the map provides some disquieting topics, it's then when they're wanting for a man that will stand in the trench where his own kith and kin is, with a frown on his face and a gun in his hand, then there might be a job for McGuinness."
Based.
It's a powerful little bit of poetry there that,
Indeed. And I dare say, if the younger generation, if they're taught about Banjo Patterson at all, which they probably aren't, but if they are, I doubt that his reference to the Chow and the Jap would be getting a look in.
Yeah. There's another hot banger from Banjo Patterson. If you would allow me, very quickly to quote.
I will.
To quote him. He was a regular contributor to J.F. Archibald's The Bulletin back in the day. That's where him and Henry Lawson got all their literature off the ground.
And the great Bulletin debate as well.
Indeed, yeah. And on the 31st of August 1901, Banjo Patterson said in the Bulletin, "Whatever danger there may be from the Kanaka," that's the Pacific Islander, "it is nothing compared to the danger of the Oriental invasion. They can do little harm in our time, But this was the same was said for the first rabbits let loose in Australia. So Banjo on point there. In his time, the Chinese can do little damage, but the same was said for the first rabbits let loose in Australia.
Yeah, that one slaps, and we're kind of seeing the result of that today for sure.
Indeed, yeah. It's interesting though.
Of the rabbits or the Chinese?
Both.
Yeah. well, the interesting thing, just to quickly get onto it, was after Federation, they passed the Pacific Islanders Labouring Act, and the title's a bit misleading. Basically, it gave the federal government the ability to repatriate people who were natives of Asia. So Chinese, Pacific Islanders, stacks of them, a huge proportion of their populations were given an amount of money and sent home to their native countries just after Federation, Chinese and Pacific Islanders included. So they did actually successfully act upon the challenge, and it's an inspiring thing. We've read about everything that happened from the 1870s onwards, that this ongoing challenge with Chinese scab labour, and that bore not only a union movement, but we didn't even get into all the statesmen and the other political groups like the Australian Natives Association that were kind of born in this circumstance and bred a new generation of leaders for the nation, which ultimately formed Federation and the Immigration Restriction Act and the Pacific Islander Labourers Act, which really did constitute a national community where everyone had a shared heritage, a shared future, and a shared sense of belonging, community, identity. All very inspirational things, and I think in our lifetimes, we shouldn't lose sight of all the things that we can also achieve. Maybe not on such a grandiose scale as that, but the struggle that we face, it's going to go for 50, 100 years or more, just like it did for the men that came before us. And as hard as that may be, and as much as people would love to flip the table over and fix the world in the next two years by making very hot takes on social media and red pilling everyone who's already invested into the global system, I do think we should just not lose sight of the fact that it is going to be a long and enduring struggle to overcome all these challenges.
Sounds like you're talking about the timescale of politics there.
Oh, indeed. You're a fan.
I am. Always love your work.
Yeah. Oh, well, very good. Thanks for that. But yeah, look, if we've got nothing else to go on, I think we should call it a night, boys.
Sounds good. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having us on.
No worries.
Thanks Grant.
For coming
Appreciate
on.
it.
Thanks, Mitch. Adam, have a good night.
Good night, mate.
Too.
When first I arrived in Corindi, those girls, they jumped with joy, saying one unto the other, here comes a union boy. We'll treat him to a bottle, we'll treat him to a dram. Our hearts will fairly give to all staunch union men. I had not long been in Corindi, not 1 week, 2 or 3, when a handsome, pretty, fair maid, she fell in love with me. She introduced me to her mother as a loyal union man, saying, "Mother, dearest mother now, he's recently joined the gang." Oh, daughter, dearest daughter, oh, this never can be. For 5 years ago, love, he scabbed it for Quaddy. Oh, mother, dearest mother, now the truth to you I'll tell. He's since then joined the Union, and the country knows it well. Now, Fred, you've joined the Union, so stick to it like glue. For the scabs that were upon your back, they're now but only few. And if ever you go black-legging or scabbing around likewise, it's with my long, long fingernails I'll scratch out both your eyes. I'll put you to every cruelty, I'll stretch you in a vice. I'll cut you up in a hay machine and sell you for Chinese rice. Or I'll skin you alive, Fred, from head to tip of toe, and down in Corindi Creek your body I will throw. So come all you young and old men, wherever you may be. It's hoist the flag, me lads, the flag of unity. Then scabbing in this country will soon be at an end, and I pray that one and all of you be staunched Union men.